distinguished interviewer tonight, who's going to conduct proceedings, William Shawcross. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you all here, and I think I can safely say that Kofi Annan is the only UN official in the world, probably ever, since the 1960s at least, since Dag Hammarskjöld died, who would command such an audience on a cold night in London. It's a great tribute to the moral force that Kofi has established in his years at the United Nations, first in charge of peacekeeping in the 90s, and then from 96 to 2006, 10 years as Secretary General. And I've been very lucky to have known him for 20 years now, since we first met in Bosnia. And I followed him and have written about him, and it's a great privilege for me to be here with you tonight and with all of you. And I think that I had prepared something else to start with, another way of starting, but I think that given what Andrew has just said about this terrible news out of Algeria, connected with the French operation in Mali, I think I should ask you first, what does this mean for Africa and for the world, and how can such events, which are tragically common, be prevented and dealt with?
It's a difficult first question.
I'm sorry. You're very good.
But let me say that Mali has been under pressure for a while. The whole Sahel region, there's been kidnapping, many kidnappings for money. And there has also been problems of drugs in West Africa because the Latin American warlords decided to use West Africa as a transit point to Europe because they had lost their transit points in the Caribbean. People are up to them. So they focused on almost the failed state of Guinea-Bissau and took over Guinea-Bissau, and it's been spreading. In fact, some of you may remember there was about 2 years ago, they flew in a plane with drugs to Mali and burnt the plane after they overloaded it, and it shows you the margin that they are making. So there has been quite a bit of concern about terrorist activities in the region. And let me say that I was worried, not so much only for the terrorists and the drugs, but that if we didn't tackle the issue of failed state, beginning, let's say, with Guinea-Bissau and others, we are going to have some of the terrible experiences we've had. We ignored Afghanistan when the Russians left until Taliban and Al-Qaeda took over. We ignored Somalia for 20 years until it became a center of piracy. And we saw something develop in the Sahel. And it's a very difficult part of the world. Some have asked the question, should the French have gone in? In a way, Mali became a collateral damage of the war in Libya, because all the Tuaregs and the Malians fighting for Gaddafi left Libya with their guns. And
with massive amounts of guns.
Massive amounts of guns. And the Malian army was no match. And not only that, the Americans have been training the Malian army, including many Tuaregs. The Tuaregs of the Malian army, some of them joined up with the rebels. And we know the story. But I think the question is, should France have gone? And people have posed that question. I think it wasn't an ideal situation, but they had to do it. The way the rebels were rolling down to the south, having taken major cities in the north, they had to be stopped, they had to be disrupted. And the West African countries were taking their time about putting together a force. I noticed today they are rushing because they had talked of a couple of months. In a couple of months there would have been no Guinea. No Mali, there would have been no Mali. And so I think the French attempt to stop the advance was right one. Obviously there are implications. The Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda from the Maghreb and the jihadist elements.
Well, that's the real question, isn't it? You've just touched on these. The rebels are not really rebels, are they? They are Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is spreading right across North Africa. And this is a catastrophe for your continent. And the question is, how can they be stopped there or elsewhere? So much of the violence and conflict in the world today is to do with Islamist extremism. And it's very hard for the rest of the world to respond properly, isn't it, and effectively?
It is extremely difficult to deal with that, but it will require the sort of international cooperation that requires that governments share information. They take steps to deprive these terrorist elements of the opportunities they have, and that we work together. But it also means we need to be nimble and we have to be quick. We are all extremely happy about open borders, open communication, which is good for civil society. But on civil society, the Al-Qaeda and the terrorists also exploit the same openness. And the only way governments and civil society can stop them is by working together and putting the kind of pressure, political, military, and in some cases making sure they are not given refuge anywhere they cannot hide.
But in the Sahara and in southern Algeria, which flows into Mali like a sea, there's very little possibility of controlling Al-Qaeda terrorists who are now heavily armed.
Yeah. You cannot control the entire territory, but you can take steps that will disrupt their operations or make the cost so high that they would not want to continue or move on elsewhere.
But their vision, their raison d'etre is not rational, is it? It's to create a new Islamic state and over all of North Africa as well as everywhere else.
You know, we used to think the same about Somalia, that Somalia can never be brought under control, nothing can be done. But recently, with the efforts of the peacekeeping forces and the attempts, the fact that they captured Kasmayo and some of their key locations, Al-Shabaab is on the run. And so there are things that can be done if there is determination and we pool our forces and our efforts. But I agree with you, you cannot eliminate it completely, but you can diminish their impact considerably if you do the kind of concerted work that is required.
Well, I hope so, because what's happened in Algeria today is clearly a catastrophe for Algeria, obviously, as well as, because that's saying for all those people who have
It's a catastrophe for Algeria, it's a catastrophe for the Sahel and for the continent, because we have enough problems on the continent, from Congo to Lord's resistance army, and now, of course, you have this. We thought we were bringing Somalia under control, but this is threatening to be even more complicated and bigger.
Yeah. I mean, you are, again, I was going to come into this later, you're very interesting in your book on Africa, your continent. You're very tough on African politicians and African dictators, and you are quite optimistic about Africa in the future, that this spread of Islamic warfare, Islamist warfare, could be very, very disruptive to that future that you describe.
It could if we are not able to contain it. If we are able to... why am I optimistic about Africa? I am optimistic about Africa because we have very strong and robust civil societies that are developing. We have bright, dedicated young men and women who've been trained abroad, Europe, America, work there and are going back. And we are beginning to see generational change in leadership, both at the political and the corporate level. And some of these young people are ambitious. They are determined to live in a country governed by the rule of law. And in fact, they cannot even begin to think of behaving the way some of the older leaders have behaved. I agree that there are challenges, but we have also made progress. When you look back, we shouldn't forget Sierra Leone. We shouldn't forget Liberia. We shouldn't forget Angola, hopefully we'll be able to resolve some of these conflicts. If we can resolve the conflicts and focus on economic and social development, Africa will be doing extremely well. I believe is the next destination. The IMF has indicated in the next decade 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies will be in Africa. And I think but I think the important thing is to tackle this issue of instability, because I firmly believe that a healthy democratic society has to be built on three pillars: peace and stability, development, and respect for rule of law and human rights. In fact, I think the third pillar is even more important than the first two, and where you ignore the third pillar and you don't insist in developing institutions and the rule of law, it's almost like building on sand. We've seen the troubles in North Africa and some of the countries there. If I had asked 2 or 3 years ago, for example, Tunisia, what do you think of Tunisia? Perhaps 90% of the people would have said stable, peaceful, economically developing, and a great tourist destination. But we would have forgotten about the rule of law and human rights. And yet it was lack of that rule of law and human rights that led to the upheaval.
Well, you're right, and of course Tunisia, that upheaval in Tunisia was the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. Do you think 2 years after that, that most of those countries which have gone through the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt and others, are that the rule of law and human rights are better respected for the people of those countries now, or are you concerned?
It will take time. It will take time, and I think these revolutions go through cycles, and there will be attempts at counter-revolutions or to contain the reforms. The leaders will be warned not to move too quickly on reform, and once you open the door, you don't know where it ends. So it will take time, but I think it will be better, because they have also proven and given a very powerful lesson to leaders, not just in North Africa and the others, that when the leaders fail to lead, the people can make them follow. The people will lead and the leaders have to follow. And it's happening not just in Africa. And the impact of what happened in North Africa will be felt further south. And look at India on the question of corruption. It took Anna Hazari and thousands to take to the streets to lead and for the government to follow to take action on corruption. The rape of a young woman, thousands took to the streets. The government knew how women were treated in India and what had to be done. But it was when the people began to lead that the government decided it's time to pass a law. And we are going to see more and more of people asserting themselves and having a say on how they are governed and making sure that the issues that are important to them are dealt.
I think in India that's clearly been a wonderful instant progress after a horrific event. But do you have a concern that the new technology, if you like, the digitized world, is going to make people, say 10,000 people take to the streets in one country and think that they can and have the right to overthrow their government because of specific concerns?
Yeah, no, there will be attempts at that, and I think we all have to be conscious about that. I mean, even when you take the question of what happened in North Africa, we were all excited with the changes, with the movement. But take Egypt. Egypt has a voting population of 45 million. 3 million took to the streets. And it struck a chord, and a change came.
But it struck a chord in the streets. Did you get struck a chord in the countryside?
No, this is where, you have a point there, but I'm coming to that. And this is why you've had some of the difficulties you've had. But even worse than that, you can have a situation where a billionaire politician can get 3 million, 4 million people into the streets and remove a democratically elected government. So we need to be careful. It's a double-edged sword, not to create the impression that we are accepting the street as a legitimate way of changing leadership. It's a democratic rotation of leadership through the ballot box.
Yeah. Well, that brings us, I think, in a way to Syria. You've spent much of the last 20 years, certainly till your retirement from your day job at that time, in 2006, meeting and having dialogue, or attempting to have dialogue with some of the world's worst dictators, warlords and mass murderers, Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, name them. And then you came out of to do it again. You're a glutton for punishment, obviously. You thought you would try to do the same with Assad in Syria, and to try and help Syria to stay together, and you failed, tragically. Why?
No, I think, first of all, I knew I was taking on a tough job. Everybody said it was an impossible mission.
Who asked you to take it on?
The Secretary General. The Secretary General approached me. There was a meeting here in London. In fact, there was a meeting called to discuss Somalia, another African problem. And even though they had gathered to discuss Somalia, from what I picked up, Syria dominated. And after those discussions, I was approached to see if I could help. I knew it was difficult, but I thought I had to try. It was extremely difficult to say no when you saw what was happening to the Syrian people, the children, the women, and all that. But I told the Security Council that as tough as the job was, we could perhaps make a contribution or help if they stayed united, gave sustained support to the effort I was about to undertake, and that there was only one mediation process, and that if we had multiple processes, the parties would have to play with us, and we were not going to get anywhere. At the beginning, I tried to build on what the Arab League had done by coming up with a 6-point plan, which everybody paid lip service to, but were not genuinely pushing or supporting. Everybody kept saying it's the only game in town, the only thing on the table. But when you genuinely believe that way, you have to put pressure on the protagonists. And those with influence were not doing it. I approached them saying they should do it.
Who do you mean?
The governments in the region.
In the region?
In the region, and some members of the Security Council also had influence.
You mean Russia?
Including Russia, the US, and we needed leadership. I mean, there has been leadership. I'll come back to that. So I didn't get the support that I felt we needed for the 6-point implementation of the 6-point plan. But you will recall on the 12th of April last year, we took a gamble and pressed them to accept a ceasefire. On the 12th of April, all was quiet. Neither the government nor the opposition shot. All the guns were silent, which demonstrated to me that they were in charge, that they could stop it if they wanted to stop it. I approached governments in the region and governments with influence to talk to those they have influence on to sustain it. It didn't happen. Eventually, we met in Geneva on the 30th of June, where all the foreign ministers and the permanent members were there, with the 2 Secretaries General of Arab League in the UN, and the Prime Minister of Qatar, Foreign Minister of Iraq, and Kuwait. And the composition itself was interesting. It was part of the debate. Originally, I had wanted to see, and Turkey was also there, but I had wanted to see Iran and Saudi Arabia there. Yeah.
Because it'd be a fun thing.
As I know, but the two of them have influence.
Or crucially.
And you cannot resolve it without finding a way of getting them to work with you or neutralize.
So are you in effect saying in a way that Iran this is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
There is a proxy war going on in Syria. Quite a bit of the things going on in Syria has nothing to do with the Syrians. There is a proxy war going on, and if we are not able to stop it, because there are those who believe there's a military solution. I do not believe there's a military solution. And those who believe there's a military solution are dead set against any attempt to mediate. I mean, they have this crazy idea that any attempt at mediation is buying time for Assad and is dragging him on. But basically, they feel if you get rid of the thought or the idea of mediation, the intervention would come or they will get more weapons. But this is not the kind of war where one side can win and the other rolls dead and accept. They will, the forces, the balance of forces is such that the stalemate will go on for quite a long time. And when one side believes it has won, it's going to lead to revenge killings, it's going to lead to ethnic cleansing of the other.
That's happening already.
It is, but it's going to get worse.
Yes.
It's going to get, this is why they really need to find a way of putting something on the table. And the political settlement we discussed in Geneva would have entailed establishment of a transition government with full executive authority, ensuring that governmental institutions work, security forces are given top leadership and they maintain their other, and that the interest of all the minority groups and everybody is protected, and hopefully an agreement that would have been guaranteed by the international community and the big powers. Because if you put something like that on the table to tell them, if you stop fighting, there is an alternative, there is another route, you're not going to lose all, and this is the way we are going, you stand a better chance of pulling some of the people away. Today, a movement that started as a grassroots movement, a peaceful movement, has become completely militarized. The voices of the peaceful ones are drowned out.
But it's a catastrophe, isn't it? 60,000 Syrians at least have already died. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees in freezing camps in the neighbouring countries. And whereas Iraq imploded after the fall of Saddam and sort of imploded into Sunni Shia violence, that same Sunni Shia violence in Syria is in danger of exploding into the region, into Lebanon, into Jordan, and the consequences could be totally disastrous.
This is why the Syrian issue is so complicated. First of all, the geopolitical location of Syria, the complexity of all the groups. You know, when people look at it in terms of Sunni and Shia, but you have the Christians, you have the Druze, you have the Assyrians, the Turkmen, the Kurds, and together all these minorities form about 40%. And so they are not insignificant. You have people that I'm convinced are not with Assad, but they are also afraid of what is coming.
Well, that's true. Assad is dreadful, but the future may be worse.
This is their fear. And so you have people sitting on the fence. And on this, this idea, and this is where the Russians and the West have had a difference. I mean, from the moment Russia accepted that there must be a transitional government with full executive authority, I had hoped we could have built on that, because that means Assad is on his way out. And the question is when and how. There are those in the opposition in particular and other countries who insist that Assad must go, and that as long as he's there, no reform is possible. The Russians argue, yes, he must go, but we don't want a chaotic collapse. You have to have the scaffolding and structures in place so that nothing collapses. But they haven't really been listening to each other. And I hope they will now begin to listen to each other a bit more, because they see the danger and the seriousness of the situation and where we are headed with further killings and very serious killings.
But I don't know this all familiar as well as you, but it seems to me that the Russians have been the main problem. They supported Assad and were far too reluctant to see his departure. Had they come to their transitional position a year ago in April, the date that you described it, that would have been different. But now Assad has killed 60,000 people. It's very difficult to see how he can be part of any transition.
There's no way Assad can claim legitimacy and stay on. You can't kill that many people have that much blood on your hand and expect it. So everybody accepts, and I think even the Russians accept that, yeah, maybe
come on, you know it's funny. You're no longer second each other, you don't have to be polite about it. Bad.
I said, bad. Even the Russians accept that. But I think what is required is for them to find a way of overcoming their differences. Divisions in any human endeavor is normal, but the challenge is to demonstrate the leadership, overcome the divisions, and move forward. And here, honestly, I think the US and Russia could have done much more than they have done. And it's not too late yet. They should support Brahimi. They've met 3 times with him.
Brahimi is your successor.
But Brahimi is my successor. And hopefully put something on the table. You have a document device that will facilitate transaction and pull them together, because sitting back and allowing this to go on. And the Russians may have made mistakes, but when you speak to the US, as I did sitting with him in the Kremlin and in the private session in Moscow in July, his arguments are Syria's our backyard, interestingly enough. What happens in Syria will have an impact on us. They also remember that some of the jihadists who went to Yugoslavia ended up in Chechnya. He argues the US is far away with 2 oceans on either side. They are not as exposed as we are. And everybody is saying Assad must go. And the more you shout Assad must go, the deeper he digs in. And then they turn on us to get it done. And it's not going to happen. We can't do it. And honestly, today, I don't think the Russians have the influence on the Syrian and Assad to pull him back, nor do the friends of Syria have the influence on the opposition, the disparate opposition.
Well, the one, we must move on because there's so much else to discuss, but the one country we haven't talked about here briefly perhaps is the principal supporter of Assad, which is the main terrorist state in the world today, which is Iran. And they, together with the Russians, have propped him up, I think.
No, the Iranians support Assad. I went there twice to talk to them. They make it clear they support Assad. No, but they tell me against the killing, against mistreatment of the people.
Well, that's very rich coming from them.
No, but that's that. No, I think there's even a better one yet. There's even a better one yet. Because after the discussion, they said, what is needed in Syria is let the Syrians decide. Whatever the Syrians decide, if they want to get rid of Assad, we will support it. You can have elections. Even you have supported elections, we will support it. But then, of course, they go on to add that what is good for Syria is good for Bahrain. And maybe if you give them time. And then they ended up by saying the solution in our judgment for Syria is democracy.
Well, that's nice of them. Listen, I'm sure that there will be questions and we can come back to Syria, but it does seem to me a terrifying prospect for the people of the region and for the destruction of... It'll be a failed state, won't it? And there's something very remarkable.
Yeah, and we haven't touched on the economic and social and humanitarian issues. I mean, you and me today estimates that there are 4 million Syrians who need help.
Yeah, sure, please.
They were going to try and reach about 2.5 million, but today they are reaching only 1.5. And in fact, they are able to do 1.5 because they've cut the rations and stretched it. And so rations that probably would have been 800,000 is being stretched to feed 1.5 million. They need money, they need support. And somehow governments are willing to send in weapons, but they are not willing to provide the humanitarian assistance. And of course, you have the thousands who already left the country. And as you use the word explode, I agree with you. It's not going to implode, it's likely to explode and explode far beyond its borders.
Yes.
And international community has to really get its act together. And I left the job because I realized that even those who gave me the job, the Security Council that said they supported the appointment and they would work with me, were not doing what they should do. And so, as I told some friends, I lost my team on the road to Damascus. So, what do you go and do?
That's very good. But I mean, what you say just reveals the flawed nature of the Security Council and the reliance upon the most powerful political institution in the world. It's very rare that they come together, and particularly when you have states like China and Russia, authoritarian states against the Western democracies led by the United States. That resolution, I mean, it seems to me perhaps wrong to always put one's faith in the Security Council. And when it came to the intervention in Kosovo in 1999 to save the Kosovar Muslims from the Serbians, you reluctantly, as you said in your book, but accepted that the Security Council would not authorize it because of Russian resistance against Russia. You accepted Western intervention.
That's correct. I accepted the intervention because we should also understand the context. I mean, you traveled with me in Yugoslavia, and we saw what had happened in Serbia, in Croatia, and others. We couldn't sit back and allow that to happen in Kosovo and pretend either we didn't know or we couldn't do anything about it. And some of the characters involved were not those who were ready to listen at the time. And so, as I indicated, there are times when you have to put force to the service of peace.
Yes, well, I agree with you, but do you think the Security Council is too often a block for that because of its failures?
It's interesting. You have the failures to agree, but on this one, interesting enough, Libya has become one of the reasons.
Yes.
Both the Russians and the Chinese told me very clearly that they did not veto the Libyan resolution, which was intended to allow the international community to go in and help the people. But they were extremely upset at the manner in which the resolution morphed or was changed into regime change very quickly. And so when it came to Syria, when I raised the issue of arms embargo, and when I was making it, let's have arms embargo, or the West making reference to Chapter 7, they saw it as slippery slope, and they would not go that way. And that has become another problem that we have.
Yeah. Since we touched on Kosovo, let's go back to your book. This, by the way, is a wonderful book, and there are many copies outside which should all be bought this evening. It's the story of...
I'm not saying it, he's saying it.
It's the story of your life, and it's from your rather interesting and fascinating childhood in Ghana to your scholarship to the United States. It's lucky that you didn't get offered a scholarship to the Soviet Union, I think. It's very lucky. Went to the United States, which really formed you, helped you form you. And then a life in the United Nations bureaucracy, which I have to say, from my own experience of writing about and living with the United Nations people, many of them are wonderful people, but the bureaucracy is horrific. And it's a very unhappy place for many, many people to work. And yet you sort of seem to be unscathed by it, and you sort of have internalized the morality of the ideals of the institution rather than the bureaucratic reality of it. And yet in the 1990s, when you were head of peacekeeping, you were involved in catastrophic failures of the United Nations institutionally. First of all, when you were head of peacekeeping, there was a peacekeeping force in Bosnia which was unable to protect the safe areas that the United Nations designated where Muslims would be protected, and 8,000 were killed by the Serbs, and then even more disastrously, 800,000 were killed in Rwanda. Again, and in both cases, it's because the UN peacekeeping mission was too weak. And you acknowledge this with great honesty in this book, and I just wonder how you feel about it today. Has the United Nations actually changed much? Doesn't it still pay lip service to words, and the reality of the United Nations is still weakness?
Yeah. Let me start my answer by asking the question, what is the United Nations? Which United Nations are we talking about? I believe there are two United Nations. The United Nations made up of member states that give us the mandates and often without commensurate resources. And the United Nations that is made up of the Secretariat. I say the United States myself. I once went to give a lecture at Columbia University and the professor asked me, what topic are you going to speak on? And I sent him a message saying I will speak on the topic, the UN is us. When I arrived, he said, Kofi has chosen an intriguing subject. He's going to talk about the UN is the US. Reminding my members. But in any event, on the question you raised, often we talk of the UN as if it's there, it's outside us, and really gives excuses to the member states. UN is as strong as the member states want it to be. The Secretariat makes mistakes, we can do better. And you are right, the bureaucracy can be abominable, and I will tell you how I survived it, probably not tonight. But and so I think sometimes we need to be able to name names. We need to be able to say, take Syria, that the governments with influence, the Security Council, the permanent members are not doing their work. They should be focused on finding a solution instead of finger pointing and calling each other names. The governments in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, Iraq, who claim they want peace, should demonstrate by action that they want peace. When we don't name them and we say the UN, we give them an alibi, it gives them a cover. And so when and it's very difficult to put this across to the public, that there are sort of the member states who have the power who will do it.
We've discussed the Russians, and I've been perhaps more critical of the Russians.
Yeah, you just fine.
Thank you. But what do you think the Americans should have done more in the case of Syria?
I think first of all, I think they and the Russians could have become much more engaged and talk privately. They should have been less public rhetoric, and they are doing it now. But they should have started and sustained it over a period. They should have tried also to influence their allies in the region. In fact, when I resigned, I did a piece for the Financial Times where I said Russia should work with Iran and China to have influence on Assad, and the others working with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others to influence the fighting forces on the ground. They are either supporting or had influence on. But nobody was ready to do that, and nobody was pressuring anyone to do that.
But there's no real leadership of the rebels, is there?
Yeah, there was no leadership of the rebels at that stage, and even, of course, today they have a new leader, but I'm not sure the intrinsic problems have been resolved. But I think there was, in my judgment, serious miscalculation, particularly from those who were expecting intervention. They thought the war was going to end very quickly. Their model was Libya, that we will end it the way we ended Libya. And given the balance of forces on the ground, I was certain it was not going to end as quickly as they thought. And that was going to take quite a while. And this stalemate can drag on and in the meantime kill lots of people before they go back to the table to discuss settlement. But
But there are some things that the international community, which is a bad phrase, I think, that all the United Nations Security Council and its members can't actually solve.
No,
the UN has serious limitations.
We have limitations. We don't have standing forces. And even if you have the forces, it's not every situation.
Well, I know that somebody in the audience who we met earlier was going to ask you, should the UN have a standing force? Is that possible?
I don't think it's possible. If we try to do something similar, create what we call standby forces, by approaching each government and asking them, what would you offer or what would you do in time of crisis if you were to be approached? Some offered battalions, others offered field hospitals. But then we used it. And my military advisor, Maurice Barry, the Canadian general, it was on Rwanda, said, try it. And he wrote to about 1,800 countries. And he came back, walked to my office with a smile on his face, but a cynical sort of smile. He said, sir, the system worked perfectly. We tested it, it worked perfectly. So I said, so what do we have? We've got the forces and the assets we need. He said it worked perfectly in the sense that everyone said no, so we know where we stand. This is, and so in a way, we still operate in a manner where someone once said the way the UN peacekeeping operations operate was like telling the mayor of New York that we know fires do break out in the city from time to time, and you will need a firehouse, but we'll build one for you when the fire breaks. Because it's when the crisis has hit that we begin to look around for troops. Look at Mali. The African countries unfortunately took them 6 months, 5-6 months. And with the way the rebels were rolling down, I'm not sure what Mali they were going to save in 6 months. And of course that's what forced the hand of France to move in. And one thing I said, I tell you how I survived bureaucracy. I mean, I usually when I took on a job, I sort of assess for myself how much contribution I can make and how much time it will take me. And once I made that contribution, I was ready to move on, to do something else. And as I indicated in the book, because of my youthful experience in the days of independence, where I saw dramatic changes taking place, I've always believed that change is possible, and you can make change, and you have to test things. So often when people in the UN told me, it cannot be done, I said, have you tested it? Let's test it. Let's see how far we can go. And of course I discovered also that the greatest impediment to reform is a restraint bureaucrats put on themselves. And they don't even want to try it. You have to push them to try. And I think that spirit also helped me.
When you tried to reform the United Nations in your last 3 years there, you did achieve some reforms. Bill Gates, in his review of your book, was very complimentary about what you achieved. Perhaps you could just tell us briefly about that, and also what are your greatest regrets at the United Nations? Because it doesn't seem, since you left, it seems to have disappeared from the face of the earth.
I think one of the things that I was happy we were able to do was also to open up the UN to the public, to civil society, to the private sector. Our own charter starts with we the peoples of the United Nations.
But it's actually we the governments, isn't it?
It was we the governments, but that's why in a way subversively I wanted to break up by opening it to civil society and the government. Because in fact, if you think it through very carefully, the ideals and the principles the UN exists to protect belongs to the people. And in a way we were there to serve them. If we are trying to make peace and prevent wars and all that, it's because we want to avoid people getting killed. And yet we were not that close to them. So when some ambassadors asked me, who gave you the authority to open the doors to the outsiders, the civil society, the business community, I could refer them to the charter. But the charter indicated we the people, and they are out there, not in the glass house. And the UN, we had to engage them. I was happy that we were able to bring poverty, the fight against poverty, through the Millennium Development Goals to the center of UN's work. We focused often on politics and conflict, but in many situations there were economic bases to the conflict. And so helping fight poverty could almost be seen also as preventive. And you did mention the crisis we went through from Somalia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and all that. And those problems really haunted and stayed with them as an organization and even as an individual. We couldn't do more.
But you said, sorry to interrupt, you said recently in an interview you wished you had shouted from the rooftops at that time.
At that time.
Why did you not?
We didn't because, again, we had a system where our relationship with the press was an awkward one. In those days, only the Secretary General spoke to the press.
Boutros,
yeah. He was the only one who spoke to.
So if you spoke out of turn, he would be very cross with you.
So he spoke to the press, and we hadn't used the press as effectively as we had. It may not have made a difference, but at least...
Does that haunt you that you didn't warn about Rwanda or else?
Yeah, and the fact that we couldn't do much for Srebrenica, but of course, as I explained in the book, Somalia was also, Rwanda was a victim of Somalia in the sense that thousands of troops were being pulled out of Somalia, and governments were not about to embark on a new adventure in Rwanda. But I kept thinking about what can we do, and that's what led to the responsibility to protect. In 1999, in the General Assembly, I raised the issue of what do we do if tomorrow we are confronted with another Rwanda? What do we do if tomorrow we are confronted with another Rwanda and there's a force mounted by a coalition of the willing and decided to go in and they don't have a Security Council resolution? Do we stand them down and allow it to go on? And it was a controversial issue to raise it at the time because quite a lot of the third world countries felt a humanitarian intervention of that nature would give undue license to the bigger powers to interfere in their internal affairs. But Lloyd Axworthy, who was a Canadian foreign minister, came to me and said, do you mind if we set up a commission to perceive this? So he set up a commission, the Canadians did, headed by Gareth Evans and Mohammed Salman. And they did a very good report titled Responsibility to Protect. In fact, they turned out to be better diplomats than I was, because responsibility to protect was easier to sell than humanitarian intervention. And in fact, we distributed the documents liberally, but I told them to hold off until the timing was right. And it was not until 2005 that at the summit we got the governments to approve it. And I think the title also had no government, no leader can come to the UN and fight the idea that he has a responsibility to protect his people.
No, come, it's a complete failure, isn't it?
It's not a complete failure, but it's good. Let's try.
You first tried to apply to Sudan, and you say in your book that the peacekeeping force there was totally inadequate to stop the Islamist government massacring people in Darfur. And now, where's the responsibility to protect in Syria? Nowhere.
No, but that's I think, is a wrong argument. I think perhaps the most successful application of responsibility to protect was in Kenya.
Okay, but with your intervention, that was a personal intervention by you, not by the United Nations.
No, but I had a mandate from the African Union with strong support from the UN, the European Union, the US. To the extent that, in fact, President Bush and Conde Rice were in Tanzania. I spoke to him and he sent Conde in to talk to the people. Secretary General Ban came when he was in hand. So we all worked together, but above all, I would give the credit to Kenyan civil society, who were very engaged and very active, and I have lots of time for them. But including even when the US was going to impose visa sanctions. So we're going to withdraw visas. And they applied it in a very interesting way. They would just announce, we have withdrawn visas of 6 Kenyan leaders who are not playing a constructive role. They will discuss, we will say the timing was right. And they went beyond that. It's not the visa of the individual, but the whole family. If kids are studying in the US, if the wife likes to go shopping, they are not getting a visa to go. And of course you can hear the buzz in Kenya. Who's next? Who else is on? So using the other pressures, political, diplomatic, and other pressures, economic, we managed to steer Kenya right. The fact that you cannot intervene in Syria, you can't intervene everywhere, but the fact that you cannot intervene in Syria does not mean you should not intervene where you can. In fact, it's almost like telling the Metropolitan Police, if you can't arrest all the criminals, don't arrest those you can. Yeah, this is the challenge we have. And in some situations, honestly speaking, use of force can do more harm. And the idea is not to do more harm, do no harm at all.
Well, I've been hogging your attention, and I want to talk about Afghanistan and many other things, but I think it's unfair that we don't take some questions from the audience. The trouble is I can't really see people putting up their hands. Ah, that's better.
It's better.
When do we have anybody with raised hands? Well, there are mics. There's somebody here in the third row.
He said, yeah.
Why don't you just shout out since you come from
Stand.
Hello? Yes. You first, please.
You can both speak at the same time.
We have.
Hi, my name is Tasneem Malhol. I'm ambassador for Freedom Charity. My question to you is why, in your opinion, I'm from Aden, Yemen, and unfortunately many countries, Middle East, as Afghanistan, Iran, and all these countries have no respect for human rights and for women issue. In your opinion, how much is the religion take part on those regions, and what's the solution that will be?
Yeah. Ambassador, which ambassador you said you were? Okay. Let me answer your question by saying that these days we hear a lot about religion. We hear a lot about fundamentalism. And there are religious fundamentalists in every religion. And religion, when you look at it and consider it very carefully, regardless of whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, it's almost education in social morality. Don't kill, don't steal, treat your brother properly and all that. And yet, people do incredible things, very brutal things in the name of religion, which leads me personally to believe that the problem is not the faith, but the faith and the way some of those religious people behave. What bothers me more is often the fundamentalists, the extremists who do these things are a small minority. But we don't hear from the majority. Yeah. We don't hear from the so-called religious leaders condemning them. Why do we let them get away and keep on misbehaving and pretending they are acting in the name of the religion we all embrace? Take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was written by people from all over the world, from Pakistan, from Lebanon, and others. And these are beliefs that can find its application in every society. And I think it is this behavior which is also leading to the sort of movements we are seeing in the North Africa and Middle East. And that strong transformational wind that is blowing cannot be stopped, at least not easily. And the pressure will continue. So one should not allow the religious extremists to appropriate the religion and pretend they act and speak in the name. I would encourage majority to reject them, to speak out. Of course, there's a bit of fear. But but there's safety in numbers. If large sections of the population stand up, and even dare the so-called religious leaders to speak up, to condemn, we will be making progress.
But Kofi, forgive me interrupting, you spoke earlier of the need to name names. And of course it's true that there are Jewish and there are Christian fundamentalists, but most of the violence done in the name of the religion in the world today, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or in Syria or in North Africa, is Islamist fundamentalism.
Which I accept is Islamic fundamentalism, but those who are doing that are also minority in that religion.
But they do enormous harm, and the Islamist religious leaders don't do much to criticize.
They have to speak up, and the majority of the people have to speak up.
But they don't.
Yeah, but we should find a way of, if we can get them to the streets, to do all the things, we should get them to use their Facebook and their street politics and power to challenge some of these things.
There's somebody here who's standing up. Row 3. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Daniel Nussbaum. I'm simply a Swiss citizen in London. Going back to Syria, again, pounding on that. I've got one and a half questions. First, I congratulate you on this opinion that we should continue the dialogue and mediating, which is not really heard in the mainstream media anymore. And so one thing is, now it's, I think Britain, France, the US, also they acknowledged representatives or councils of the opposition in Syria, which I might be mistaken, but they didn't all recognize the same council. So there's already a kind of, but it's portrayed usually in the news as that's just the opposition, although they're not agreeing on everything. That's just, what do you think of that as that kind of Western states acknowledge an opposition which, in a country where there's still a sovereign leader of a sovereign country, as if it would be the other way around, we wouldn't accept it, not at all. Yeah. And the other thing is the pounding on the bad boys, the Russians, which I really don't like. As you said, they were the ones that still try to negotiate, and the options that the good boys bring, which might end up in military action, I don't think it's a better solution. But mainly, sorry, it's a long question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but it's long enough.
Yeah. I think I've got you addressed.
Acknowledging the opposition, that's
yeah. No, I think the acknowledgement of the opposition by some governments as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people complicates the prospects of negotiations. Because if you're already recognized and you begin to see yourself as taking over, there's not much to negotiate. It's a question of how and when you take over. But we also do not really know the opposition, their capacity, how they will organize themselves to do this. I'm sure there are many good people, but it takes time to put together those structures. And this is where I felt that we should have focused on one mediation process, the one approved by the Security Council, and everybody working in the same direction. I think the Russians and the Americans could have listened to each other a bit more. And as I said, I see signs that is beginning to happen. And my personal disappointment was after, since you said you are Swiss, after the meeting in Geneva on the 30th of June, where they had an agreement on substance, on political settlement, going into quite a bit of detail. I expected them to go to New York and build on that and really work out practical aspects and, if you wish, produce a roadmap that they would try and get the Syrian parties to embrace. But they went to New York and started fighting again and focused on Chapter 7, which both the Russians and the Chinese had told us in Geneva 2 weeks before that they would not accept. So the substance was dropped and they fought over Chapter 7. And
you should perhaps explain what Chapter 7 is.
Chapter 7 is a UN resolution that authorizes enforcement, the use of force as a last resort if necessary, imposition of sanctions where necessary. Because in my judgment, it was more important to agree on the program, on action, what you're going to do first. We should agree in the communique, and then decide how you're going to implement it and what happens if a party fails to implement. But they put the enforcement in first, which also led me to believe that some governments probably didn't want to move forward and that I was wasting my time in the process getting Syrian people okay.
Are there any other questions? Yes. In here, the pink scarf. And then there's somebody at the back there, a man at the back. And then there are 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 or 20 people not there.
That's very helpful.
My name is Zina Klaus, and I'd like to ask her that in this continuing war on terror and all Arab Spring and now Syria, how have you come to understand what victory means, and how would you define it?
Let me go back to where I began. I said there's no military solution, and that when it comes to intervention, I haven't seen any countries lining up to intervene, and that they need to be brought to the table to talk. I would also want to remind all of us that when you look at the Arab awakening, I'm using the Arab awakening rather than spring. Spring is too short, and the awakening is going to take quite a while. The Arab awakening, the 2 countries that did not pick arms, the 2 populations which did not pick arms, are the ones who've done very well in terms of moving towards change, Egypt and Tunisia. In Yemen and Syria, where the population were forced to take up arms, once you do that, you play into the hands of the government. They will tell you we are dealing with law and order. Assad doesn't even recognize this opposition. He talks of terrorists and criminals, which is really not the case. It was a grassroots political movement which started. And here, the lesson from Gandhi's experience becomes quite important. And for me, victory in the situation we are discussing is ensuring that the autocrats are gone. There is a situation where the people have a say in how they are governed and by whom. And they are free to go about their business without fear or intimidation. It won't happen tomorrow. It will take time. So for me, it is that kind of victory I'm looking at, not sort of a military type victory.
Over there.
Could I take one this side because the mic.
Okay, of course. You're in charge of the mic.
Hi, my name is Tanya Kini. I have a question for you. We're talking a lot about Syria and other countries that you dealt with as a Secretary General. You didn't touch on Cyprus though, and I just wanted to ask you, with the gift of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently with regards to that country? Thank you.
No, we did lots of work on Cyprus. We came fairly close, and we had a referendum, which the Turkish North voted for, and Nicosia voted against. We also had some unfortunate developments because the negotiations had taken place between Dentash and Clarides. And the two of them knew each other very well. They both went to school here. In London, they studied law. They fought bitterly, but they could also laugh. They also teased each other. And in negotiations, that sort of dynamics also helps. I recall when Dentash wants to provoke or tease President Clarides, he'll bring out his camera and start clicking away. And then they'll say, put that picture, I'm not your star, and they will sort of laugh about it and continue. But Clarides was voted out just before the referendum. And Papadopoulos campaigned very hard against it. I'm not saying that if there had not been that change, the Greek Cypriots would have voted for the referendum, I don't know. But in any case, they voted against it. I personally at the time thought that Europe was making a mistake accepting a divided Cyprus into the Union. And by doing that, they removed one of the most powerful pressure points that we have. And so one thing I would have liked to do was for all of us to have put pressure on the European Union to be a bit more patient and work with us to unify Cyprus rather than bringing in a divided Cyprus.
There was someone up there.
Good evening. Thank you both again for coming this evening. Sir, I'm curious, given your unique vantage point as Secretary General, could you tell us a little bit more about the function of the Security Council?
About the
Function of the Security Council, or dysfunction, if you will. What I'm interested to know is, on balance, would you think that member states on the Security Council should function more in through the auspices of their own national foreign policy, or should they be thinking a bit more broadly about what's more in the common interest around the globe? And feel free, please, to name names if you wish. Who might be, let's say, more globally minded than others. Secondarily, if you were to have exclusive right to reform the Security Council, how would that look?
I think the Security Council does good work. It has made mistakes. In some cases, it's been paralyzed. We complain today because we are focused on the Security Council post-1989. During the Cold War, there were lots of things the Security Council could not do because of the divisions between the West and East. The Council, since the collapse of the Cold War, has been able to do quite a lot. I think in terms of the role of the Council, I would want to see a Council that takes a broader view of collective national interest. We are also all human. It is extremely difficult for governments to take that broader national view, broader international view, without their own national interest playing a part, however little a part. But on some issues, they have been able to take broad international interest in mind. But I think the Council needs to be reformed, and as Secretary General, I did put forward proposals for reform, which would have increased the membership of the Council from the current 15 to 24, 25. And that would have allowed creation of additional permanent seats. I think, for example, it's not justifiable that India, with about a fifth of the world's population, is not on the Council. Japan, that is the second highest contributor. Africa with 54 countries doesn't have a single permanent seat, or Latin America for that matter. And in fact, if you broadened the membership and made it more democratic and representative, the council would gain in greater legitimacy. And so I would want to see the council expanded, and in addition to the creation of the 4, 5 or 6 permanent seats, you would have a limited additional rotational seats. But it wasn't easy. And the problem was not always with the permanent members. Of course, they would have had to approve it. They looked after themselves at the time of the creation of the organization. You can't take the victory away without their approval. But the problem was not always that. You take the African region. My proposal was for them to get 2 seats. 3 candidates wanted it: Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. Egypt immediately started by arguing, let's share it between North Africa and South Africa. 1 seat for Africa north of the Sahara, and the second one for Africa south of the Sahara. Implication, the one north of the Sahara is for Egypt. And then the other said, Africa is Africa, let's all compete. Latin America, Brazil saw itself as natural. And I recall, soon after the proposal had been made, former President Menem, he was then President of Argentina then, came to see me and said, things are going very well in my region. We have excellent relations with Chile, with Brazil, with Ecuador, all our neighbors. Tell me, Mr. Secretary General, why do you want to give us something to fight over? This permanent seat. And you have the same with India and Pakistan. Pakistan wouldn't really support India getting a permanent seat. China tells me, short of permanent seat for Japan, we have all the flexibility. So you see the dangers and the difficulties in reforming the council.
I think I was told that Kofi Annan had to leave at 8:30 exactly, but he's agreed to stay on a bit longer, but I think we should have one more question, and then I'll ask you to just say anything else that you want to say about what issues we haven't discussed, like Afghanistan or whatever else. Somebody over there. I apologize to everybody else.
It's difficult, and thank you very much for what you've said. It's made one sort of understand much more directly what you've been up to over the years, and much appreciated. Just wanted to ask whether you could enlarge on where is most of the funding for Al-Qaeda coming from, and if there's a way of curtailing it, and whether it could bring substantial changes to the position.
So most of the funding, sorry.
Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda. Okay. But that's a good question, because some of the money, the suspicion is they make themselves. In fact, the leader of the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb has been accused of being at the center of the kidnappings, and they get good money to release the hostages they pick up. And I mentioned earlier that there are also some problems, drug problems in West Africa, which sometimes also finds its way to funding some of these activities. And in fact, at the end of this month, we are setting up a West African Drug Commission to look into the problem of drugs and its impact on politics, governance, and how you stop the type of loose money that flows around from this sort of thing. And in some situations, some of these jihadists and extremists get contributions. They get contributions from families, from wealthy people, from Saudi Arabia, and others. But I don't think they do it in terms of they think they are giving it to Al-Qaeda to attack. It goes back to some of the religious issues that we talked about, that they are making a contribution for religious purposes of some sort. But they do have money, and as you know, they can also put a price on your head. I had a price on my head by Bin Laden, you remember? He put a price of gold on my head. But I'm lucky I'm still here to talk about it.
Well, I'm afraid I do apologize for drawing this evening to an end, because I know that there are dozens of you who want to ask questions and hundreds of you who want to continue hearing Kofi Annan. So I think the only fair way of concluding it is to ask you to just talk briefly about any subject we have not addressed that you want to say about the United Nations or your extraordinary career.
No, the only thing I would want to say is the title of the book, Interventions. I don't want us to get the impression that my focus was on military intervention. The UN intervenes in almost every human endeavor. We intervene, as we discussed, on the poverty issue, on HIV/AIDS, on major disasters, on women's issues. And I hope we'll continue to do that, to try to improve the lot of the people around the world and to live up to our charter that charges us to work on behalf of the peoples. So I'm very happy that we've had the chance to have this conversation and to meet so many people. And I'm also extremely happy that so many young people came. It's your world, it's your future. And my generation has not always done what we should have done. And I'm not sure we'll hand over to you the world we should. But I'm glad you're getting engaged early and are determined to be the change that you want to see in the world. So thank you very much. And it's your world.